The title of this video is going to be the headphone of the year. But now that I'm actually looking back, I think that this might actually have contention for not only headphone of the year, but headphone of the decade. So this headphone beats the German luxury of the HE1. It beats the French beauty of the Focal Utopia. It beats the Romanian stylizing of the Meze Empyrean and the iconic Chinese Susvara. And what beats all of those things is American precision with the Abyss AB1266. Now, when I heard this, I had the Susvara coming up, and I also had the HE1 coming up, and I wanted to wait to call this the best until I heard those because I had substantial reason to believe those might be a bit better. But after listening to those, I think that this thing sounds the best. Audio for me is all about compromises and what compromises you have to sacrifice to get the most of what you want. I'm of the belief that you can't have a mid-rangey experience and a V-shaped experience, and you may have a preference even day to day of which one you want. So for me, the best headphone is the one that checks the most amount of boxes possible, and I think that is the AB1266. Now, the reason why I picked this headphone, and I reached out to Abyss to loan me a unit for this video, is because I think that in 2020, this represents still the best and the pinnacle really of sound and build quality. And even though these headphones came out a while ago, they are constantly, and I mean legitimately constantly, making small revisions, small changes, and small tweaks to better what they already have. Now, to understand this headphone, I think I have to express a little bit about kind of what this company is about, the methodology behind this company, because every audio company has a different story. So these guys are engineers, right? Through and through. They started as engineers. They're still engineers. It's a very small family-run business. And their passion for this hobby comes from being unsatisfied with every other product on the market. So they decided to make their own. And I love that. And I really appreciate not only the confidence, but the actual ability, the end result in making the best headphone they could possibly make and standing by it. But I think because of this, people might have misinterpretations about what the design is intended to do. Because most headphones are intended to look a certain way, they're intended to appeal to a specific audience. They're intended to look cute or expensive or luxurious. There's a whole bunch of reasons to design a headphone a specific way. This headphone is designed under one principle. It's basically designed to allow the drivers to do their job for your entire life. And this extremely well-built metal chassis is part of that equation, is making a headphone that has as little failure points as possible. So you can kind of think of this as professional grade equipment. If you look at another industry like the medical industry, or if you look at cameras or car equipment, not everything that functions well is pretty, but it functions well, it's precise, and that's its purpose. And I feel like this headphone really falls into that sort of kind of professional vein of equipment. Now, it's not professional in the sense that it's a studio monitor, even though I think it totally could be. It's not marketed and not advertised as that, even though if you wanted to, you could certainly use this in my opinion. But that is the basic reasons as to why I think that this is possibly the headphone of the decade. But because I'm here with this, I can finally listen to this on all my equipment and compare against some other things. And that's what I want to do. So this has God-tier details and presence for the treble response. This thing is incredibly clear in a way that few other headphones are, even headphones like that HE1. One of the surprising things, and actually somewhat disappointing things for me, was how under-detailed the HE1 seemed in comparison to this. I was really expecting that headphone to blow the detail out of the water for basically every headphone given the price, but it really didn't do that. Now, there were some other properties of that headphone that were fantastic. But one of the properties about this headphone that makes it stand out is the detail retrieval and the resolution capability of this headphone being legitimately beyond, quite noticeably actually, every other headphone that I've listened to. Now, this will obviously come down partially to frequency response, this being a little bit more boosted in the top end than that HE1. But ultimately, I think it comes down to driver technology. Now, the HE1 is an electrostatic driver, and those have their own limitations, but the driver technology in here for a planar magnetic headphone is probably the best ever for any headphone. And it comes down to a bunch of different things: the magnet shape, the magnet strength, the diaphragm, width, things like that. Now, a lot of companies claim some amazing things about their drivers, and that's actually an under-marketed aspect of this headphone, I feel like. But whatever marketing they do, and whatever I've been told about this driver, I think it more than delivers on the sound quality end, especially for details. Now, this is what I would consider like inescapable detail amount. And this is one of those things where you're checking off boxes, and when you check off one box, you sacrifice checking off other boxes. So this is extremely detailed, the most detailed. And I like that about it. But you lose some of the other boxes like smoothness. You may not always want a super detailed headphone. So I think this is about setting your priorities. And for me, this lines up perfectly with my priorities most of the time. Now, mid-range here is pretty fantastic, though it's not my favorite. This is one of the areas where I do think the HU1 pulls ahead for tonality, for example, and kind of ease of listening to the vocals, but is still notably under-detailed. And in fact, in every region, it's under-detailed compared to the 1266. And ultimately, this isn't as warm as I and I think some other people would prefer for the vocal response, but it's still clear in a way that no other headphones really are. Now, I do want to partially walk back a statement I made in the review. Now, in the review, I called this headphone unnaturally detailed. I don't actually think that's the case. I think the details are exacting, but I actually think that what I was more picking up on was the flaws of the microphone that was recording the music rather than this headphone. Because I've been doing tests, I've been focusing on this, like obsessing over it almost, going back and forth between different recording studios, between different artists, between different songs, albums, etc. And sometimes the vocals seem really bleh on this headphone, and then other times they're just like the best thing ever. And I think that this comes down to probably more than the bass response or the treble response do. I think it's more about the recording quality. And I noticed that this isn't with instruments as much as it is voices. And I think as humans, we're kind of more in tune with vocal timbre than really any other region. So I think we're able to pick up the nuances a little bit better than, let's say, listening to a cello, for example. Now, that being said, that's kind of a win-lose for certain people. So, this headphone's inability to lie, like some of the other headphones will that maybe are a little bit more enjoyable in the mid-range. I think that ultimately just comes down to what you want to hear from your music. And this is a toss-up area for me. Now, coming from the Diana Phi and the Diana V2, the bass response is one of the more impressive factors of this because I felt like it kept everything from those, added to what they already had, and then included bass response and sound staging in a way that those headphones did not have. So it's like on like every category is a notable improvement over the cheaper alternatives. This headphone is extremely versatile with world-class sub-bass response. It's also, in an overall bass response, extremely clean and probably the fastest bass that I've probably heard, I think. This headphone does not seem to produce bass in the typical fashion from most headphones. So sort of almost the bass gets stronger as it gets lower and lower, but it retains clarity through everything. And then you can also, depending on how you fit this on your head, if you leave a bit of a gap behind the pads, you can actually get even deeper bass than would be considered, I think, typical for this headphone if you really want it. It's definitely bassier than things like the Dianas, but if you're coming from like an LCD4, that has more of a thicker kind of wall of bass that kind of slaps against your ear, and it can sound exceptional, and it's a very good headphone as well. But this maintains a little bit more clarity, a little bit more precision, but less total impact than that headphone. Though the sub-bass response is like pretty exceptional. If you're into like perfect, clear, unrestricted, honest bass, this is probably the pinnacle headphone that I would point people towards, I think. Now, something I don't actually talk about a whole lot, but I want to talk about presence and like the impact of things. And this is a combination of sound staging, imaging, dynamics. It's a combination of a lot of different things. This headphone will leave little tiny dents in your brain with how precise the imaging is. So you hear like a tick or a slap or a crack of something, and it is just frozen in time and space. And it's like tickling your brain with different imaging placements and different sizes and depths of the sound. and different radiances of the sound. It's really pretty incredible. Now, I think the one thing that isn't as good as some competitors is the sound staging. And I think that if I were to guess anything, I think it comes down to the driver size. This isn't as big as some other planars that are on the market in terms of total driver surface area. And to me, it would appear that there's a direct correlation between scale and driver size. The bigger the planar is, usually if your frequency response and driver capability matches it, it'll produce a larger scale. So things like the Arias or the HE1000 SC will produce a larger sound scale and wider sound staging than this will, even though I think the imaging placement is superior to both of those headphones. So comparisons. Let's go with the big bad wolf, the HE1. The HE1 is more open and airy sounding. It's also got a warmer mid-range and a little bit more perhaps on the enjoyable spectrum than the clinical and analytical spectrum for the overall sound signature. It is significantly more expensive, which means that this is significantly less expensive, so this might actually seem like a bargain, only in that comparison though. But I do find the overall detail response of the 1266 pretty much across the board to be more. And I think that this comes down to probably driver technology, perhaps tuning, but really I think that the details of the 1266 are extremely impressive. Now I also want to caveat that comparison by saying I've never had the HE1 here. I don't have it here now. So, comparing back and forth is not really something that I could do. So that's a bit unfair for the HE1. But those were notable things that I was running through in my head when I was doing the review. The Susvara. This is actually in the same realm, I think, as the HE1 in terms of the differences between the two. And to me, it's clear that the 1266 is chasing precision and technicality in a way that the Susvara is not. But the Susvara has some other benefits. So it's got the benefits of sound staging. It's wider, it's again more open and airy, similar to that of the HE1 compared to the 1266. It's also got kind of a warmer shift on the general tonality, but I actually find that I like the vocals when they're good on the 1266, like with the perfect recordings. I think that they stand out and pop more on the 1266 than they do on the Susvara, but you may prefer the tonality shift of the Susvara a little bit more. A lot of people have been asking about this review. I'm running into technical issues, which because this video is not about that, I won't talk about now, but I will talk about that when I eventually get to it. But just know, basically, I'm trying to get a second pair to compare against because I'm not 100% certain that what is going on with this particular headphone is what is considered typical. Sorry, it's been so delayed. Now, the Aria is another very, very impressive headphone. It's, again, not as clear or as clinical as the 1266, but I think by now it's established that I don't think anything is. So, compare that to everything else and apply that to every other comparison. But this does have some legitimate benefits, but also some faults that the 1266 does not have. Benefits, of course, being soundstage, this being one of the wider planars that I think are on the market right now. It's also got that scale factor, but the 1266 has far better clarity, far better mid-range, far better treble response, and even, I think, better bass response. Now, at the price being $1,600, I think that this is one of the more unique bass responses that you can actually get, and there's actually not too many headphones that deliver bass in the way that I think this delivers bass. This always had like a transparency factor to the bass. It was there. It was present, it was deep, but it didn't obstruct anything. And you could sense the bass, you could hear the bass, but you could hear everything through it. And I don't feel that that's the case with some other Heifmans. Even the Susvara, I don't think quite reaches the same bass transparency as this, even though the Susvara is a little bit stronger. Now the 1266 has that transparency. It's got that clarity and see-through nature to the bass, but it does hit harder and significantly harder in the sub-bass response than this does. So pretty much across the board, I feel like the quality of all of the sound is a little bit better. This also has some problems between 5 and 10K that the 1266 does not have. This has a little bit of vocal shoutiness in that region, and female vocals specifically, or upper end male vocalists can come across quite harsh in that region. whereas the 1266 just glides over that region with no issues whatsoever. This headphone is also a little bit brighter, but again, less resolving. So you end up with, for the price, I think it's good. And when I review it, it's in comparison to its price. But in this comparison, the tonality of those treble notes seem quite plasticky in comparison to the very accurate sounding treble capability of the 1266. Okay, the Diana V2, which is my preferred of the Dianas. Now the V2 actually has more intimate vocals. It's a little bit more kind of in your head. It's not so out there like the 1266 is. It's also got a warmer shift. And I think a big thing to do with this is the substrate material. That's one of the only differences between the Diana Phi and the Diana V2. There's a couple other differences like the trace and the colors, but that's one of the bigger driver differences. And the tonality difference between those two materials is quite noticeable. Now, to be honest, I don't find the V2 to be that far behind in most areas, but the problem is it is behind in most areas. Not far, but a little bit. The resolution capability is greater on the 1266. The mid-range presence is a little bit better on the 1266, though not as intimate, but more specific. The bass response is stronger in the 1266. The sound staging is a little bit wider on the 1266. The imaging is a little bit more specific. It's just kind of nickel and diming this V2. It is cheaper, like $2,000 cheaper actually, but it is better. But because the V2 is so close with a slight shift in tonality, I actually go back and forth on which one I prefer. And the V2 was almost going to be this video. This video is almost going to be about the V2 because it has some legitimate benefits over the 1266. Those benefits are the looks, the lightweight feel, the drivability being a lot less dependent on the amplifier than that of the 1266, and the comfort is just amazing. I actually really like the way that the Dianas fit versus this. Now, the build quality on the Dianas is exceptional and certainly the best at their prices. Especially the V2, like at $3,000, that's the best build you're going to get anywhere. But the methodology behind the build is a bit different, and I don't think it's as tough as the 1266. To wrap up my conclusion, I think at this point it's simple. Like this, for me, with the boxes, the check boxes of sound quality, it has some limitations because it's sacrificing those for other types of sound. Now, this is just specific to me. Like, my checklist is not the same day to day, but it's also not going to be the same as your checklist. So you may want just insane amounts of bass response, and this isn't going to be that headphone. You may want an insanely smooth, kind of lush experience, and that's not this headphone. That has its own place. It's very good, and it may be the best for you, but as far as kind of where I would rather make sacrifices, I'd rather have just the clearest, most resolving experience possible over kind of a more lush sound signature, if that makes any sense. So for me, this is the best. On a side note, personally, I love the methodology of this company, right? Like I'm kind of a more competitive guy, so I like what they do. It's a bunch of engineers who weren't happy with what was available to them, so they made their own, which is very admirable in my opinion. And then later it's like, okay, well, we have this incredible sounding but bulky headphone, and if you don't like the big and bulkies, well, we're gonna make an incredible sounding, like thinnest planar headphone on the planet. So what do you got to complain about now? Oh, you don't think it's that tough? Well, we ran it over with a Jeep, so go F yourself. Like, it's a bravado that not every company, especially audio companies, have, and my gorilla brain just appreciates it, man. I love the thought process behind it. Okay, I think that's gonna wrap it up, guys. I appreciate you guys watching this video. Go check out the links in the description down below, and until the next one, I'll see you guys next time.